good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this Q&A with our patrons. This is the fourth of our Q&As, and tonight we'll be in conversation with Pádraig Ó Tuama. The reason we're having these Q&As is because the Open Table Network is in the process of becoming a charity. And I'm the network coordinator. My name's Kieran, if you haven't met me. I've got the privilege of coordinating the Open Table Network. We're in the process of registering as a charity, and we've asked several notable Christians who identify as LGBTQA+ or as allies to become our patrons, and they're advocates for us, speaking about us and supporting us in the public eye, and we're proud that they believe in what we're doing and want to have their names associated with us. So tonight we're in conversation with Pádraig Ó Tuama, who's a compelling poet and skilled speaker, a teacher and group worker. And from 2014 to 2019, he was the leader of the Corrymeela community, Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation organisation. He's a regular broadcaster on radio on topics including conflict and faith, LGBT inclusion, and the dangers of so-called reparative therapy. His published work includes poetry, prose, and theology, and we may be hearing a little more about some of that published work later. And with his partner, Paul Doran, he's co-founded 10 by 9, a storytelling event where 9 people have up to 10 minutes each to tell a true story from their lives. It began in Belfast, and it's now has satellite events in many other cities. So we hope to share some stories tonight. So good evening, Pádraig, and thank you very much for your time and support of the Open Table Network.
Thanks, Kieran. It's lovely to be with you, and it's nice to be in the room with everybody.
So, Pádraig, I thought we'd start with a question that you often use in your group work. I had the privilege of being in a group at Corrymeela a few years ago where you asked if right now you were to write the story of your life, what would the first sentence be? So, I know you've written an autobiography. I wonder if your opening sentence of your life story would be different if you wrote it today.
Oh yeah, it changes every hour, I think. Right now, what would my first sentence be? I think I would say, I grew up with 3 languages.
I can assume 2 of those, but I wouldn't know what the third was. So I know you speak Irish and English. What was the third language for you?
Secrecy.
Oh. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what I'd say. Yeah, today.
Yeah. Yeah. So we may explore a little more about why you felt the need for secrecy as we go forward. But it's really a brilliant exercise. How did you come upon that as an idea for group work?
I've always been interested in the opening line of books. People say don't judge a book by its cover, and fair enough, but certainly my approach to a book, I notice a book's cover, but I definitely do judge a book by its first sentence. Partly, I think I judge as to whether the author trusts the reader in the first sentence. If they think that the reader is capable of following along, I think often you can hear a confidence of beginning or a curiosity of beginning. Yeah, and then studying Hebrew as well, looking at the opening sentence of the book of Genesis, how it begins with the letter B when it technically should begin with the letter A. That struck me as something curious about how opening sentences know more than we think they know. So yeah, I think it evolved out of all of that. I've been using that question for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years.
Yeah, it's great. And so you now know Hebrew. Do you know any other languages now that you didn't grow up with?
Oh, well, I don't know Hebrew. I have lots of random theological vocabulary, so I can talk about righteousness and circumcision and the devil and all of those things in Hebrew, which wouldn't really help you if you got lost in Jerusalem. I did French in school, so I mean I have schoolboy French. I loved it, and then I lived in Switzerland for a year, so I can get by in a conversation in French. Yeah. Then I can use sign-supported English as well with American Sign Language. So that's not the same as speaking sign, but certainly I can make myself understood. Yeah, bits of Greek as well. Again, theological, all talking about righteousness. resurrection. Lovely.
So, so I mentioned your autobiography. It's in the shelter. I thoroughly recommend it. And so you've written about growing up as Catholic near Cork in the Republic of Ireland. And you also said that you knew from the age of 11 or 12 that you're gay. So how did you hold that growing awareness of your faith and your sexuality together, or not?
Well, it was confusing. I mean, I was born in 1975, and so around the mid-80s, there was the beginning of ads on the telly about HIV. And so all of that was happening at the same time. Awareness of HIV and AIDS, a lack of any actual proper conversation and information about that, never mind about being gay. I am from a very devout family. My parents are daily mass goers. And I was inclined toward that same kind of devotion. And I suppose the few times that I had heard anything to do with being gay was around times when I would have gone somewhere where there were evangelicals speaking. And the language I heard there was a lot more precise in terms of hell, or, here's how it's caused, or here's how it's cured. And I use the word gay deliberately there because it was particularly only gay men that those conversations were talking about. And I think that demonstrates a curiosity and an obsession with the masculine, and a derision towards trans experience, toward lesbian and bisexual experience as well. I remember hearing some people talk and say, they didn't think that lesbians were a problem, because basically the understanding was, as if a woman met the right man, then they'd say something that we all know we all know the awful end of that sentence. And so in a strange way, being spoken about was because you were perceived to be a threat. Being made invisible, I think, through the bisexual, lesbian and trans experience, that I think was another deeper level of violence as well. And so I felt very torn. That's why a language was secrecy. I mean, yeah. I knew I was gay. I knew there was something sinful. You're awakening to sexuality and your own pleasure, awakening to having to perform a certain amount of straightness amongst the lads at school, awakening to the fear of hell, awakening to really, really ill-considered theology and psychology from people who should have known better in terms of the shit they were saying. So it led to me all kinds of closets within closets.
I was wondering if that was the root of learning secrecy from an early age, but yeah, that's not an uncommon experience for those of us whose identity is different from what we're expected to be.
Totally, yeah.
So do you still consider yourself to be a Catholic today? Because you've worked so much ecumenically in your later career that do you consider yourself Christian or a Catholic Christian in particular? Or?
I don't know what I think of myself. I certainly have studied theology. I certainly am very Catholic in culture and also in theological inclination towards sacrament, and that. The word Christian is a complicated word in Ireland because usually it's a synonymous for becoming a Protestant. Are you a Christian usually means, are you an evangelical here? And so it comes across a bit awkwardly here. So I don't know. And similarly in the boundary between faith and doubt, and between belief and agnosticism, I'm really comfortable being good friends with the agnostic part of me and good friends with the hopeful believing part of me. I suppose I don't draw a distinction between any of them. What interests me is to think about religion and to think about the questions I have for religion, and to have some kind of centering practice, call it prayer, call it reflection, call it writing, whatever it is that makes you enhance the vocation of your own life.
So you described in your book as a young man going through reparative therapy for some years. And you described it as a groundless, invasive process designed to cure me of being gay. So if it's okay to share a little about that, how did you experience that? And at what point did you realize you didn't need to be cured?
So, I mean, I was involved in the charismatic ecumenical movement. and I had a job working within the context of Christian ministry, I suppose. And I had to fill in an application form for this job. We lived where we worked. And there was a question in there about, have you struggled with the following? And there was 4 tick boxes of, 4 deadliest sins: alcoholism, occultism, drug addiction, or homosexuality. So I ticked the 4th one. And then, I moved into this Christian lived-in community on a Sunday, and on Thursday night in the prayer meeting, there was an exorcism. And what's really clear now is that somebody had told the exorcist, as she was, about what was going on. And she came over and manipulated a confession of sin out of me, and then gathered people around, and they screamed at the devil and me. And I was kind of outed, I suppose, when she was screaming at the demon of lust. I was mortified, having lust being called out. Anyway, there was 2 more exorcisms, and then I was told that because those exorcisms had not been successful, that I would need to go along to some form of reparative therapy. So I started to go along to see somebody who did not have any qualifications in anything, really. I was frightened, I was desperate to belong. And I think in the name of a desire to belong, you do terrible things to yourself. You quieten all kinds of dignities in yourself. So yeah, I went along to this man, and I trusted that because he said he was an authority in psychology and religion, that he was. Of course he wasn't. So many people in those years were just making shit up. And I think that was something I had to learn. I was enculturated as what would be considered to be a very good Catholic. I never thought that my opinion was something to be listened to. I thought my job was to submit to an authority and to believe that, to take that in, and to find every single way where I could follow along the magisterium and learn everything I could. I am from a family that really values education. Both my parents left school at 14, and I think the 3 things in the family that we believed in and that were really powerful was religion, the Irish language, and education, particularly science. And so those were very, very strong in the family. And so I was desperate, and I loved learning. So people would be making all kinds of stuff up about the hierarchy of hell, absolutely making it up. And I would be taking it all down as if it was fact and trying to learn it all off. So it took a bunch of years, really, before I realized some of these people are just making it up. And it was a lack of respect for them rather than a growing in respect for myself that made me realize I have to ask other people. I have to find other ways to ask questions. Yeah. And a German friend of mine marched me into Waterstones in Dublin and said, stand in front of the gay and lesbian bookshelf and choose 2 books, and you're paying for them yourself. And I was just embarrassed in case I'd be seen in front of the gay and lesbian bookshop. I mean, this was 1994. This was not a situation where, had anyone seen me, I would have felt safe. Maybe it was 1995. Oh my God, I was so frightened. But I'm so glad for her, and that she was insistent that I paid for it myself. Yeah, and I ended up Taking a Chance on God by John J. McNeill, which was great. And then yeah, I found another book too. I mean, at that stage, I was still buying books about how to be cured, but I was trying to buy books by people who had qualifications, and I suppose it was a long, slow journey out of that. And a huge amount of it for me was a kind of a backbone of coming from a family that believed in learning and realizing this shit is made up, most of the stuff. And I began to lose respect for the intellectual viewpoint of people who were just making stuff up because they had a pre-decided opinion about gay people.
Thank you so much for your candor, Pádraig. We hear stories of a similar kind in a number of open table communities. The people's desire for belonging is so great, as you've expressed so candidly, that people want to belong so much that they'll try and conform, even if it means bending themselves out of shape to do so. And
so devastating yourself.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, what we hope, our aspiration for open table communities, is to help people find a more authentic form of belonging, where people can conform themselves to the shape that God's calling them to be, not the church might be calling them to be, perhaps.
Yeah.
So as a young man, you began studying for a bachelor degree in divinity.
Yeah.
And you mentioned having a strong calling to priesthood, but I wonder if you could share what put you off going to seminary.
I did complete the Vatican degree. I did a pontifical degree in theology. I wasn't living in the seminary though. I was kind of parallel to wanting to become a priest. I'd visited various monasteries and then landed on the idea that I would try to become a priest in the diocese in which Belfast is. And I had been talking with the bishop, and he said, well, and I was doing the degree along the way because I knew I'd have to do it. And so it was just clear to me that I was going to be a priest, and that when I finished the degree, I'd join the seminary. And that maybe my time in the seminary would be a little bit shorter because I'd already completed the pontifical degree. But then Pope Benedict became Pope Benedict, and I had read everything that he'd written really about LGBT people, which had been really derisory. So I remember swearing the moment that I heard that he was chosen. Wasn't it 2005? I think it was.
Yeah.
At Greenbelt that summer, a document was leaked, and it was reported in the Vatican that there was going to be a new policy put in place in the Catholic Church that banned any men who had had the homosexual tendency for longer than 2 years from becoming priests. Which it just seemed ridiculous. Like, who decided 2 years? So like a year, 11 months and 29 days is absolutely fine. And do they have to be concurrent? You know, and if I've had a fling with somebody, is that a night or is that, you know, an hour? How do you count all up 2 years? Anyway, it was kind of ridiculous. But the bishop came around to the house with a bottle of wine. He's a good man. And he said, you won't be able to go forward. And I was furious. I was terribly angry with him. I called him a fucking coward because I thought that. I said, you know, for a fact, there's a huge proportion of the priests in this diocese are gay. And you know that so many of them will be devastated by this new closet within a closet already.
Yeah.
And why don't you speak up and speak for that? And he said, look, I'll lose that battle and I have to choose my battles. And I understand that compromise is part of these terrible situations, but I was furious. And I suppose then I realized it was over, but it felt like being divorced by the church. And of course, all along the way, I'd begun to come out and tell people I was gay, but I still had felt like a calling to the priesthood. And so I did have ambivalence. And I wonder, would I have ever gone through with it, or had I gone through with it, how long I would have lasted? You know, all of those things are there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I know if there was a call, I certainly had it.
But I know several people who were hugely impacted by that document. It's a tremendous injustice.
The language in it wasn't even accurate. And like the Catholic Church does pride itself on its intellectual tradition and on the Catholic Science Forum, and you know the engagement with the sciences and the arts and with literature. And the document said that the document that came forward from the Vatican gave the reason that men with a homosexual tendency weren't capable of psychologically healthy relationships with either men or women. How can you quantify that? Like, that is not a theological statement. That is a pretense at a factual statement. And if you're going to make a factual statement, you've got to be able to substantiate it with evidence. That's absolutely ridiculous. And I was incensed at that text because it just felt like there is no justice. So yeah, I mean, I had been a daily mass goer for years, well over a decade, and a daily Stations of the Cross prayer, you know, all of that. And I was furious, and I couldn't bring myself to go into a church. I felt in total exile. It's awful.
So I wonder if there's a connection here. You mentioned about your fluency in languages, and you alluded to some of your travels. So you settled in Belfast in 2003, but you'd had a nomadic decade, and you'd moved from Cork to Dublin to Switzerland to Australia via Lithuania, Uganda, the Philippines. So I'm curious about how you experience being a gay man, or perhaps a closeted gay man in some cases, in other cultures. How was that for you?
Yeah, well, I was very definitely closeted and frightened. I suppose at the time I wasn't imagining that there'd ever be anything else, so I was getting gradually more and more used to it, and I was relieved if there was a week or a month when, you know, I wasn't distressed. The older I got, the more curious I became about sex, about intimacy. The angrier I became too. You know, I'd see people talking about, you know, that that the joy of being able to hold their partner's hand, you know, these are heterosexual people, or the joy of being able to talk to somebody at the weekend, or have somebody to complain to at the end of a bad day at work. And I would just think, I want those things too. And why are those things literally demonized in the language that was being used? And it was the humanity as well as the eros, but it was the eros combined with the humanity that I just thought, this makes no sense. The viewpoint that was being given me was falling apart, and it was crumbling. My health wasn't good either. I hadn't been very well in my 20s. I'd gotten a post-viral syndrome after a terrible, terrible flu, and it just turned into a post-viral thing that never went away. And my immune system was overactive, so I always felt like I was just the day after a bad flu. You know, the first day back at work when you feel like I'm fine, but I'll probably collapse in bed when I get home tonight. And I was like that for about 10 years. And there was a substantiated syndrome that I had, but I also think that my body was in a low place and was likely to be open to taking that. And so initially I thought it was okay, and it was quite easy to live this kind of frightened, closeted life, because I liked speaking, I liked learning, I liked leading stuff, I liked being led, I liked being involved. And so I tried to be the best person in ecumenical Christian ministry as I could. But I kept on getting angry. And I was angry at the injustice of all the things. And then I felt guilty at the anger. So I found a really good Jungian psychotherapist who worked in a Jesuit retreat center. And it wasn't anything like Christian counseling. It was proper psychotherapy. And he saved me, I think.
Well, thank you for your candor, because you know, it can be immensely traumatic and distressing to live with this amount of secrecy. You know,
awful. Yeah.
This is why we need safe enough places to come and share our stories, don't we?
For sure.
So you went on to become the first Catholic to lead the Corrymeela community, Ireland's oldest Christian organisation, dedicated to reconciliation and peace building. So how did that association with Corrymeela come about? And you're still a member now, I believe.
When I moved to Belfast in 2003, a friend of mine had said, you might want to check out the Corrymeela community. And I didn't really know much about Corrymeela. What I did know was that Corrymeela ran retreats for LGBTQI Christians to come together, an ecumenical retreat. And at Corrymeela, it isn't just the Catholic Protestant barrier that we look at. Obviously, that's a very political barrier in the north of Ireland, but it's also the doubting, believing, faithful, cultural barrier too. You know, you've got loads of people who are affiliated with religion and happy to turn up to a liturgy, but not overly interested as to whether there is a heaven or a hell, because they're really interested in the here rather than the hereafter. And I really liked that, because ultimately I realized that my interests in the world were very secular. I loved religious literature. I love biblical literature. I find it fascinating. But I've seen so much damage done in the name of certitude about heaven or hell that actually I've mostly rejected any interest in any language about that. And I'm very interested in I'm very, very interested in the way that we talk to each other in the here and now. If there is a heaven, it'll look after itself. But there definitely is a here, and I'm really interested in that. And Corrymeela is very interested in that, through bringing people together across political divides, etc. And I'd always written poetry. I think poetry ultimately was the outlet for that language of secrecy in me. I used to write poems and poems and poems and carry them in paper packages in my pocket. You know, I wouldn't want anyone to have read them. Because they were so private. I used to write some of them in code that I'd then subsequently forget and wouldn't be able to read. But there was a need to make marks that had some level of recognizability for my life. And I know that all of us in this room can remember times when we noticed visibility of somebody to go, that's just like me. I'm not the only one. There's at least one other. And of course, we know there's much more than one other, but it's so moving when we realize that. And so I started to get involved with Corrymeela, and it wasn't, and it isn't that Corrymeela says, oh, you're welcome regardless of being LGBTQ. It isn't regardless, it's a full regard to say, that's great, tell us about it, brilliant. And you're also a poet, great. You also speak Irish. Are you free next Thursday? Because we need somebody to come along and facilitate something. You know, like any charitable organization, you know, they're desperate to go, do you want to come as a volunteer? Magnificent, you know, we'll sign you up, you're in. And that was the beginning. And what I really liked was that there was no secrecy about being LGBT. And there also wasn't a kind of a pitying, patronizing approach either. I wasn't a charity case. I wasn't anything special. It was regarded, and there were other people there too with different experiences, different relationships to religion or not. And that suddenly I was in a community, and I just thought, this is extraordinary. I don't think I'm ever going to leave. And I haven't. You know, I've been a member for years now. I did lead Corrymeela then from 2014 to 2019. I always knew I'd lead for 5 or 6 years. My deepest calling is to language and poetry. And so I knew that I was thrilled to serve for that period of time in the role, but that I would always be pursuing language and poetry, and would always be finishing Corrymeela and then being promoted to being a member again, which is a lovely thing. I love being a member of Corrymeela.
It is a beautiful place. I thoroughly recommend folk who haven't been to make their way when we're able to go there again.
Able, yeah. I suppose I should say it's like a third order if you're Catholic, or it's like a membership organization. Yeah. People don't live at Corrymeela. You know, people are in their ordinary lives. But they've made a commitment to go to a few weekends a year, maybe to be part of a network, to say a small prayer every day, and to bear witness to the importance of reconciliation in the everyday life. There's about 180 members, and I'd say 90% of us live in the north of Ireland, maybe 85. There's a decent bunch in Dublin, and then there's people in Scotland and England, and then a few further afield as well. So yeah, it's like the Iona community, if you're familiar with that. We do have a centre where we run events and where there is a volunteer program, but the members of the community are ordinary people in our ordinary lives with work or looking for work or retired or studying.
And you mentioned the annual LGBT themed retreat. So yeah, so that predated your involvement with the community.
It used to be called Radical Love, I think it was called. And initially they were quite secretive retreats, necessarily so, that were really pastoral in tone for LGBT people to have a safe space, one safe space a year to talk about spirituality and sexuality. Father Paddy was the priest who was the faith and life worker at Corrymeela who was running those. And then they died out, and I said to somebody at Corrymeela, why aren't they being run anymore? And he was the director at this stage, and he said to me, because you're not running them. How about next month? My God, I learned to be careful whenever you highlight something to, people in charitable leadership. Yeah. So then we ran them for a while, and it became clear to me that there was loads of pastoral spaces, and ultimately pastoral spaces are best found in your city or in your location or somewhere where you can go regularly. And that what we needed was a space to support people who were in some form of faith leadership. Maybe as a clergy person, maybe leading a small group, maybe being a musician, maybe just being involved in the parish council, or just being somebody involved in your church or parish in some way. And so, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, we started off these retreats called Blessed are the Brave, which was bringing together people who wanted to be inclusive of LGBT people in their faith leadership. And I mean, you've been on a few of them, Kieran. I suppose it's true that about 80% of the people who come are ourselves LGBTQ. Yeah. And then we have a small contingent of straight allies who come. And that's been really important to come, the friendships and the connections. There's a whole bunch of people that tend to go, I'll come every second year rather than every year. And it's great. We love it. And we missed having it this year, but we look forward to having it next year, please God.
That's good to know. Yeah, I've been twice myself, and it is a real privilege. And I've also been to similar weekends at other retreat centres, but Blessed are the Brave is distinctive. Firstly, I love the name, Blessed are the Brave. That's fabulous. But also because it's not just LGBT plus folk only. So the fact that it's a space where people can come together and in dialogue and really share stories, and it's a risky place. People make mistakes and say the wrong thing, and but that's part of the challenge of I think it's safe enough to make mistakes and learn how to be in dialogue, isn't it? So that's
totally, absolutely.
So it's good to hear that there's still a desire to continue that, because I think it's a really important contribution to the LGBT plus Christian community on these islands. I think, it's a really beautiful thing. Just a couple of questions around Open Table. So, I mean, a little bit of our Open Table story. Now, the language of Open Table was not familiar to me because I was brought up Roman Catholic, and the Catholic Church famously doesn't practice Open Table. So we were asked. Somebody at our first meeting said, "Will it be Open Table when we have a communion service?" And I asked what it meant. And when she said it meant everyone is welcome without condition or test of worthiness or membership, my heart leapt within me and said, "This is exactly what it needs to be." So I'm interested in what Open Table means to you, not just in the theological definition, but in your experience of holding conversations around many tables in many places. What does Open Table mean to you?
Well, I mean, there is the theological definition, the communion table or the Emmaus story, etc., and they're lovely. But I suppose when I think of tables, when it comes to having worked in conflict resolution in the north of Ireland for many years, I think of the amount of tables around which I gathered with people who had lived through the Troubles or who had lived through profound homophobic abuse. And sometimes in group facilitation spaces, you can have people sitting in a circle and it's empty in the middle. And that's a lovely thing. But I found that with groups who were particularly traumatized, that sometimes sitting around a table where people could feel like there's a bit of them that's hidden, and maybe you can put your hands on the table or you can have a cup of tea there, that could feel like a small echo of hospitality. And when you think of parties in people's houses, so often there's a bunch of people sitting around the kitchen table at a party, and that's certainly always where I want to be. There might be whatever people are reading on the table, or some bill that's left over, or bits of food, or a half-empty bottle of wine, that somehow the table is a gathering place for all of those things that can be shared, and people can lean into each other and hear all kinds of things, that there's enough gathering around that strangely with that table, people lean in more. There can be light held on the table too, like a candle or something. And so table for me, I think table, if I was ever to imagine what I think an object for God would be, the word is table. Not because I'm really defined as to what I think about God might be, but because I certainly know that if there is one, that the shape of God needs to be a table around which we gather and on which we share and around which stories happen. So I love the title of Open Table. I think it's great. I'm thrilled to be a patron, because I do think that what we need is a really highly populated, richly networked, hugely respectful and engaged network of inclusive faith places that can advocate in public, that are independent from church structures in order to be able to speak prophetically and not be frightened and not be manipulated by church structures that can sometimes be much more frightened, even though they're more equipped with resources. And also a network like Open Table that's really well connected with the other networks, because every one of the LGBT inclusive networks has its own particular job to do. And one of the things that happens sometimes in organizations of goodwill is that rather than facing the thing that might kill us, homophobia, the organizations begin to bicker among themselves. And what I love about what you're doing in Open Table is that it's so well connected, and you're not trying to steal people. You're just saying, it's great. Here's what we're doing. Here's how you can join. Here's these other great things. Let's meet each other at loads of events. And I think that's a really wise way to do it. And I'm thrilled to be a patron of the work.
Thank you. And that's something I took inspiration from at Corrymeela. There's a great generosity of spirit there about just not it's not about being in competition with one another. It's about saying, well, this is what we do well, and we love to celebrate what others do well, and not feeling threatened by one another. But you have a wealth of experience in reconciliation, and as you know, around conversations of conversations around sexuality and gender identity, churches can be quite inhospitable places.
Totally.
So how would you say that we can sit together at an open table with people who would disagree with or even wish to exclude us?
Well, there are all kinds of ways to do that. Sometimes, I'd be involved in stuff that is specifically only for LGBT people, and somebody would say, oh, aren't we being exclusive? And like, no, because there's 99 choices in every single city about where folks who are conservative or anxious or rejecting of LGBTQIA people can go. We're creating perhaps the only place where a population can come and feel safe. And explore that. So partly I think it's really worthwhile advocating for difference. I also think that not every LGBT person needs to be versed in being able to justify theologically their own existence. I've had so many young LGBT people get in touch over the years, especially when I became leader of Corrymeela. There was some controversy, people were preaching against me. I started to get some hate mail and trolls and all of the really predictable kind of stuff. The BBC referred to me as the highest ranking LGBT faith leader in Ireland, and I wanted to correct them because I wasn't the highest ranking LGBT faith leader in Ireland. I was the highest ranking out LGBT faith leader in Ireland, because we know for sure, I'm never interested in forcibly outing anybody, but we know for sure that our population is everywhere in faith leadership. The church would probably fall apart if the LGBT people decided to hold a protest and not turn up. Same with women, and so there are so many ways within which, there are so many of us in so many places. And what bothered me is that some of the people who were writing were saying, here, can you train us in running and how to stand up to our minister? Can you train us in how to stand up to our bishop or our diocese or our whoever's running the big faith conference that they're going to, and speak about the Greek and speak about the Hebrew? And I would usually say, well, no, I'd much rather that you became safe first, and then get to the stage where if you're still interested once you're safe, well then sure, come along and I'll recommend some books to read, or we can run some training. But I don't want you to feel like that's your only option. You might just want to go, I want to learn karate, or I want to pursue a degree in music, or I want to open up a flower shop. Do what it is will give you life, rather than having to fight for these tools for justifying your own existence. And for me, I don't think that open table needs to say, oh, we'll sit with anybody, because that can cause real damage. There's a question of going, how can we curate certain tables? And if somebody's coming to say, I want to talk as to whether LGBT people are capable of what God would call love, to go, great, we'll curate a table. Just to let you know, we'll only be choosing people who are safe enough to come to that table. There's other people who won't. I took part in a debate for Belfast Pride years ago, and I'm not sure what I think of debates, but anyway, there was two arguing for the life of LGBT people, and our dignity, and two arguing against, one of whom was a reparative therapist. And one of the people who was arguing against said something really derogatory about my partner and I from the table. Now, it was a very queer audience. It was run as part of Belfast Pride. There was 300 or 400 people there. And so he said something horrible, comparing Paul and me to being in the moral equivalent of an incestuous relationship, but I could see on his face that he was looking forward to me swearing at him. I love strong language. So I could see that if I said, fuck away off, that it would have been suddenly, see, the homosexuals are militant, he can't control his tongue or whatever. And I knew it was a trap, and that his hope was that I would fall into it. So I said, I cook a damn fine curry, and I'd like to invite you to my house, and let's talk around my table around this, what you've just said, and see if you say in private what you're willing to say in public.
Yeah.
And he was frightened, and I was really pleased. I wasn't doing it to be a doormat to be walked on. No. I was doing it to say, I am not frightened. And this is what a table can be. A table can also be a place of extraordinary argument. So when he came, And he brought somebody, and I had a friend there too, my friend Sarah. She was thrilled because she was assumed to be an honorary lesbian all night. She's not, she's heterosexual, but the absolute assumption was that I would only have, you know, other LGBTQ friends. So she was thrilled the whole night that everybody kept on referring to her as, you know, you and your lifestyle. And she was like, oh, amazing. It's great to have a lifestyle. So one of the people who would come said, is your partner going to be here? And I said, no, he's really glad that we're meeting, but he left the house tonight because he doesn't want to be around this table. This isn't something he's interested in. He's not unsafe, it's his own house, but yeah, this isn't a table that's of interest to him. And they were like, oh, and I think that's a way to have an open table too, an open table that people can leave, and an open table that people can say, that's beneath me, and I won't take part in that. Good. That's a way that these tables can be robust and muscular.
And what a tremendous act of non-violent resistance to offer hospitality instead of demonizing in return. Amazing. Now that echoes one of the questions we've had from our friends gathered tonight. So as you, I'm sure you well know, there's conversations in the churches in Britain. So the Methodist Church is debating a document called God in Love Unites Us, and the Church of England is talking about living in love and faith. So we've had a question that says, given your experience of facilitating reconciliation, can you offer any thoughts as to how to engage positively with these conversations, if indeed it is something you would encourage people to do?
There's a bit of a mantra that I like, which is love the gospel and take no shit. And I suppose that's one of the things that I'm interested in when it comes to imagining these kinds of environments. It is a necessary compromise to be part of that. If anybody is going in hoping that they will be confirmed in a deep sense of their belonging, I would say don't do it. You will be sorely disappointed, which isn't to say that others shouldn't, but don't lower your expectation and realize that these are part of the church government of necessary compromise. And so only go in if at that stage you feel like you want to be and are safe enough to go through that, you know, and therefore you can go, yeah, this is shit, and I am helping people take 2 steps really slowly, really carefully, when actually I think we should have taken 50 20 years ago. But to go, yeah, I'm here for this, and I have compassion for this for now, and that's really good. And then for the people who know, actually it's not for me for now, don't crucify the LGBT siblings who are doing that, because they are helping people take a few necessary steps. One of the things that happens in colonization and empire is that empire thrives on dividing people amongst themselves. And I think empire and the anti-LGBT approach thrives when you've got some LGBT people saying, come on, let's find a way to work slowly with the church, and other people saying, you're barely queer at all, why don't you go off and join the heterosexuals? There's only one winner in that, and it's not us. And what I'm really interested in is people going, oh, it's not for me, but I'm so glad somebody is doing it. And I'm really interested in when somebody has done that work for 10 years and says, oh, I need a break. And people don't think, oh my God, they're burnt out, or they're falling apart, or they're in a crisis. They're just saying, I need a break. And where a serious question about your own spiritual and mental and personal health is, what support will I need if I'm to go into these places? Where am I finding really thriving, flourishing belonging? And therefore, how can that give me support to go into a process where I will probably have to justify my own dignity on a regular basis? And then to go into those situations with a sense of your own power. Regularly what happens in those situations is that they'll gather together and they'll say, look, we've all hurt each other here, and they'll establish this idea of a common table of negative experience. And these days I will object even from the first moment to say, most heterosexual people here have not been put through reparative therapy, threatened with violence, told you're going to hell because of this, and we can list it off, and to go, I fully understand that we disagree, but there is no equivalency of power in this conversation. So let's begin in truth and conflict analysis. And I say this as somebody with 20 years of experience in conflict. Conflict analysis will fail unless it can have an accurate analysis about the imbalances of power and the presence of threat in a room. And I'm not frightened of saying that. And it's frightening usually to the straight people in the room. Yeah. They are the people with the most power and the most fear altogether. I'm the person usually with the least power, but the least fear. And it's great to live like that. I wouldn't want to be in the other situation.
That's tremendously freeing. You've reminded me of a quote, you probably know it better than I, about that you're involved in reconciliation when people in your own community feel you've betrayed them.
I know, I wish that weren't the case, but it is so true. And I do think that the LGBT community and the LGBT faith advocacy community, I think we need to be very wise. There will be some groups that are new and shiny and they'll have all the online stuff. There'll be some groups that seem old and fuddy-duddy. There'll be some groups that do the policy work. There'll be some groups that do the social media work. And it's easy to say, oh, they're hollow. You know, if you scratch beneath the surface, you'll see no, none of this, none of that. All of the groups need to do whatever they're doing and populate a field to say, I'm just in my corner of this field. And the worst thing is that when fighting happens in that field, because then we're doing the job of our opponents for them. Again, it's divide and conquer. It's the old tactics of empire. And when funding comes into it, I think that's where it's really divisive, because that's a subtle way within which, if there's funding available for 5 organizations and 20 LGBT faith inclusive organizations apply for it, suddenly there's this thing about, oh, they only got it because they know this person, they only got it here. How can there be open conversation and a real equality between the leaders of those organizations to speak about, we're being forced into competition, but what are some creative ways about that? How about we queer that up a bit? And that's exciting.
Absolutely. So we've got a couple more questions from our friends with us tonight. So you spoke about how, as you were coming out of reparative therapy, you lost respect for the people pushing it rather than a growing respect for yourself. So what was the turning point or the catalyst where you moved into growing and developing self-respect? So you're clearly in a much more resilient and strong place now to be able to have the kind of conversations you've just described. So what was that turning point for you where you began to have more respect for yourself and not just less respect for those oppressing you?
You know, it's a series of stories, really, some of which is just about getting older. I had a friend, Kevin, years ago. Kevin had been a priest and had left the church, and he and I were out in Dublin for a meal. I had moved away, but whenever I'd come back to Dublin, I would go out for a meal with him. He was kind of my only, what would be called, actively homosexual friend back in those days. It was all very exciting about who was active and who wasn't. And we were out for a meal, and we were in a restaurant, and the fellow who was serving us was really effeminate, and I didn't know what to do with it, you know. And typically there was even an old kind of internalized homophobia part of me that was embarrassed for him or found him funny. I think he assumed that me and Kevin were a couple, and he was being very flirty and pally, and I was awkward and laughing out of my awkwardness and internalized homophobia. And just before our dinner came, Kevin said, lots of people put up with a lot of shit. And basically Kevin was saying to me, don't you think this guy deserves respect? And I think Kevin saying to me, don't be a dick, that made me think, if I can show that kind of respect for this guy, because there was an instant conversion, I realized immediately, I found nothing funny about this man who was serving us. In fact, I thought he was extraordinarily brave, and he was himself with a level of courage that I didn't have. And that changed in an instant. And I realized that has to change for me too. And so that's one story about something there. It was actually another gay man challenging me about the awkwardness I had about being a gay man around other gay men. And I'm so glad for the challenge, and I'm so glad for friends who'll say that kind of stuff to you.
There's an echo of that in another question that, so you talked about being in exile. You've talked a bit about what that felt like, but how did that process of coming to the promised land happen? Or have you reached your promised land, perhaps?
No, I'm still in the underworld singing songs. No, I've given up on being found. I'm not interested in it anymore. I suppose I find, this is the poet part of me, I find a deep interest in exile. I find a deep interest in the hope for belonging, knowing that anything about that will always be filled with love, but also filled with limitation. yeah, I think there's something about yearning for the thing that might be beyond us that can help us, that can help me enact something in the here and now that is making connection, making community, making courage, making the sharing of story, all of those things. The longer I have felt estranged from the church, the less angry I've been, and the more comfortable I am with the human endeavor to try to find a way of living a life with meaning, to try to find a way of showing love and receiving love from people, as well as not feeling defined by languages of God. Yeah, I'm doing a third degree in theology. Like, I love theology, so I'm not lacking in reading about religion. But I find that the people who I trust the most are the ones who have the most careful reading and the most careful approach to not being didactic. And I find that so liberating.
Wonderful. And so we've got a question about the referendum on marriage, same-sex marriage in the Republic of Ireland. So many of us, were surprised and delighted. So what do you think were the major factors that affected that sea change in opinion in what's still culturally, at least, predominantly Catholic country?
The Sydney Morning Herald had the best analysis of the referendum in Ireland, and the Sydney Morning Herald said this wasn't a vote against Catholic Ireland, this was a vote by Catholic Ireland, because you can't have 65% of the people vote without an enormous population of those. Well over 65% of the Catholics of Ireland were voting for this. The media campaign was extraordinary. There was a really clear level to say this is what collaboration will look like. It wasn't divisive. There was beautiful ads on the television. People were supported in terms of saying, here's how to have a conversation with a family member who might be younger or older than you, who has caution about this. The word homophobia, true as it might be and have it as an analysis for much, that wasn't being flung around, because the impetus was to say, let's invite people into this. And then there was the home to vote hashtag on Twitter, which was Irish people coming from all over the world using the hashtag on Twitter, home to vote. And it was overwhelming. It was one of the proudest days of being Irish. It was glorious.
That was amazing. I was really deeply moved by that. People traveling, making a special effort to travel all over the world, from all over the world, just to
from
be
Australia, coming home to
to
say, I can cast one vote here. Now, I do understand that putting the right to have love recognized in law, putting that up to a public vote is problematic. So, and that is a necessary compromise that was accepted, and I fully accept that. I don't think these things should be put to the public vote. However, given the fact that it was being put to the public vote, and Ireland has a referendum system that's very different to the British referendum system. Ireland has a written constitution, and so therefore the amendment for how the constitution would be changed was already on the table, and people were voting specifically about the day after this referendum, will we change the written constitution from that to this? Yes, done. Britain does not have the rules about that, because Britain is a parliamentary system rather than a constitutional system. And so there is a way within which the popular vote in Ireland used very clearly the way that the popular vote is written into law in Ireland. And I think that's really important to understand the legislative distinctions between Britain and Ireland. And so there were so many people who knew that that was the case, that every vote mattered. And also that it wasn't just a vote about equal marriage, it was a vote of something to do with a national apology and a national recognition, to say, we see you, we know you, we are us. And it was so beautiful, overwhelming. I wept for a day.
That's what an uplifting story with which to kind of draw our time to a close. Just one brief question, maybe just to end on a really uplifting note of resilience, really. So you've written that one of your great inspirations is in the words of St Irenaeus, in the 2nd century Bishop of Lyon. The glory of God is found in a human being fully alive. So what helps you feel fully alive? And how might you help others to do so? How might we help others to do so? I
remember the day I read that line, the glory of God is found in a human being fully alive. and thinking, oh, everything changed for me there too. That was a before and an after moment, to realize anything that brings about flourishing is something that we might call God. So learning music, meeting up with your friends, dancing at a party, cooking, whatever it is that brings you great life, surfing, going on a hill walk, walking with your dog, reading a poem alone, catching up with your best friend. All of these things as a small experience of glory are an experience of that which we might call God. And therefore, I think as we look at ways within which LGBT people become safer and safer, that too is a work of something we might call God. At the first year that I was leading Corrymeela, there was about 30 people contacted me within the first couple of months. Most of them had heard me being preached against by their ministers in churches. And what the ministers didn't know is that quietly they were advertising, here's a safe LGBT space for all the closeted gay people in the room. So I thought this was magnificent. It was kind of funny, the derogatory shit they were saying about me. It wasn't anything new. It was very old and kind of boring, really. But what was great is that suddenly on direct messages on Twitter or on Instagram or Facebook, or somebody knowing somebody to say, oh, here's Pádraig's number, I got all these people got in touch. And I started to hold really quiet retreats at Corrymeela. We found some money. I started to host meals at my house in Belfast. I live near the city centre. There's a bunch of people, and most of them were people in their early 20s at university, going through such distress because of the terrible things they were being told. I'd cook a huge curry, they'd come along, and then they'd go out clubbing afterwards. It was fantastic. Sometimes they'd invite me, and I'm like, my God, no, I'm old enough to be your uncle. Get out of here, you know. They fell in love with each other, they fell out of love with each other, and it was magnificent to see the flourishing of language and friendship and the relief of people speaking to each other. And that was happening around my kitchen table. And I consider that to be one of the most glorious things I've ever had the opportunity to do. I love those bunch of people with all my heart. I'm in touch with so many of them, and it was magnificent to have been a corner that they trusted, and that they brought their stories to the kitchen table and shared their stories and bravery and support with each other. They did all the work. I was just the lucky one to be in the way.
That's the power of hospitality, isn't it? And thank you so much, Pádraig. We've got some amazing feedback in the chat, and inspiring is the most common word, I think. Yeah, it's been really lovely. It feels like we could go on all night, and I really look forward to being around a table with you. And you know, as soon as we can make that happen, it would be an absolute delight.
Yeah. Well, it's lovely to be with you, Kieran, and to Sarah, and to everybody who's been in the room. Thank you so much, and all deep courage and joy to you in the pains that we have to go through to deepen our own joy and flourishing with each other. Thank you.
Amen to that. Thank you. Our next Q&A with our patrons is on the Thursday, the 18th of March. So it's just a month and a day from tonight. Again, 7 to 8 p.m. And that's with Bishop Paul Bayes. Now, so when Paul Bayes became the Bishop of Liverpool in 2014, in his inaugural sermon, he spoke of an open table made by a poor, generous carpenter who offers a place at the table to anyone who wants to sit and eat. Little did he know that there was a ministry called Open Table in the next church to the cathedral. It was a very uplifting moment for us. He visited in July 2015 and gave us a mission to give the love that you share and the openness you manifest as a gift to the wider church that struggles to receive it. He's become an outspoken ally. He's become a patron of Pride in Liverpool, as well as becoming a patron of Open Table. And he's now involved in the Ozanne Foundation, which tackles prejudice and discrimination in religious organizations. He's written a book called The Table, where he's expounded his vision of the church as an open table. And he's now the co-chair of the Global Interfaith Commission on LGBT plus lives, which is calling for an end to violence and criminalization against LGBT plus people and a global ban on conversion therapy. Thank you very much, everyone. And we look forward to gathering with you again very soon. Go well and good night. God bless.